My story with non-monogamy was like, I started stepping into it in a relationship where neither of us really had experience with non-monogamy, but decided that if we were going to continue deepening the intimacy that we had, that was the only way we wanted to do it. There's a book, Polysecure, and if you haven't read it,
yes,
highly recommend it. But something that Jessica Fern talks about is like there's sort of people who are non-monogamous more sort of like contextually and situationally, and then there are people who are non-monogamous really kind of as an identity. And for me, it was like very early on that I was like, oh, this is my identity. Like, I don't really know what I'm doing yet,
right?
But I can't go back.
Welcome back to Open Late. I'm your host, Jessica Sfandiari, and today I have with me a friend and coach of mine currently. We've taken breaks here and there, but I definitely know it's something that I need, and I talk about that here on the show. So I'm really excited to share with you this wonderful woman who is a somatic coach and also a sex and intimacy educator. You guys, she has helped me tremendously over the last 6 months, I think. And even before that, just as friends and women in the space of sexuality, intimacy, non-monogamy, and things of that nature, just to see other women who are sharing openly and authentically and helping others really be liberated in those areas just gets me so excited. So first of all, I'm so happy we're friends. Second of all, we finally made it for you to walk into my home.
Instead of hovering in the doorway in COVID.
Yeah, I mean, that was a really... Okay, first of all, welcome to the show.
Thanks. I'm really happy to be here.
Yeah. The funny story. So you've never been here. Irene came to the doorway. I think was it in 2020 when we didn't know what COVID was?
No, it was exactly when California was shutting down. And I know that because we were canceling a 300-person event the day that the mandate came out that you couldn't go over 200.
That's right.
And we were like living on the East Coast and catching a flight back.
Oh my God, you guys were still on the East Coast.
Yeah.
That's wild. So yeah, it was in March of 2020 because we canceled Pasha and Lauren's birthday as well. For people who are like, want to know the exact timeline, we still had a dinner and there were only 12 of us, which turned into a bit of a party, like a little house party, and everyone got COVID. And no one could get tested. It was like pre-testing, pre-everything. Actually, because our friend worked in a hospital, he got one test, and he and Pasha both clearly had COVID. We were like, who's going to take the test? And then they ended up, so our friend who is in healthcare took it. It was positive, and Pasha ended up paying, I think, $900 for a test like 2 days later.
Wow.
Which is absurd to think about now that we're so deep into, like, you know, we've been through this pandemic.
Like, I just got 8 free ones from the pharmacy.
Everything's free. But at the time, it was so intense and scary, and Pasha's dad was here. Like, he was actually staying with us while we all caught COVID, and he managed to not get it. So Pasha wanted to be sure, and it was just a whole I can't even, like, okay, that's a whole we're gonna close the door on that.
So COVID over there. But that's the other time I've been here.
Yeah, and that's right, we kind of like waved. Were you picking up speakers?
I think we were dropping stuff off.
Oh, you were dropping stuff off. That's right. Okay. Yeah. You know, it was like a very interesting, we're not going to cross over this line. Anyway, let's talk about why we're
whirlwind
here.
of a time.
Yeah. And likely during this time of pandemic, the work that you do is so much more important than ever for people.
I mean, it's been a really interesting... What was really interesting for me, like in sort of the beginning of COVID, was the part of my work that's doing like nervous system education and sort of like teaching people about like how does stress and trauma like operate in the body became like really central to everything, because it was like everyone was freaking out and having all these different responses to it. And so a lot of the like online workshops and stuff that I was offering around that were kind of like how to make sense of what was going on if you were suddenly having a really strong reaction, which as I'm saying that now, actually ties right into all the stuff that like we've been talking about with non-monogamy, because that's also sort of the premise for the writing that I'm doing, is like, if you're dipping your toes into non-monogamy and having a much stronger reaction than you were anticipating, like, here's how we make sense of that. And it's, you know, actually a lot of the same stuff.
Yeah. Does all sort of trauma and stress and anything that would really activate the nervous system happen essentially the same way for most people? And we're just not taught about it, so we're not aware of it.
So the way that I've been framing this a lot lately, actually, is the difference between stress and trauma is just how you integrate it. Meaning, the way that your nervous system works, it's designed to respond to what's going on in your context, right? It's designed to react to different stimuli. So something might activate it a little bit. Something might kind of cause you to like withdraw and shut down a little bit. And if you go through something that activates you, you're meant to then kind of come back to your baseline, right? Like the body is always looking for how to balance out, how to be in homeostasis. And if it's just a stress response, you digest that in your body and you come back to that baseline. If it turns into trauma, it means you're getting stuck kind of like in that extra stress response. You're not really able to like integrate and come back to that same level the same way.
Got it. So my mind automatically goes to imagining that most people, because they're living in, like, what happens when you're just in a constant stress response and you're never coming down? Does that become like a chronic, traumatic experience for people?
It depends. It depends on the manifestation of it. One of the things that I wind up talking about a lot, because this is my diagnosis, is complex PTSD or developmental trauma, is sort of that state of being when you're much younger, like in your developmental years, and having many sort of like ongoing small traumas, really. I was going to say stressors, but like they are traumas because you don't get to integrate them. So there is kind of that iteration where it can be an ongoing traumatic experience in like how your childhood operates.
Right.
But that can also sort of take the form of your body just staying in that activated response and creating a pain response. Right?
Physical.
Like, yeah. So like a lot of chronic pain comes from similar mechanisms in the nervous system of like it's perceiving a threat, and so it's responding to that threat as if you're being attacked.
Right. Okay. My mind is like, because you just explained, I think, what I always sort of try to in my limited like education around this stuff, when I'm like, yeah, of course, you know, trauma that can, you know, activate your body. Like I say those terms, I have like no basis for really explaining to people other than, yeah, what's sort of energetic or emotional, if you don't process it, turns into physical in your body. But you just explained sort of how. So thank you.
And one of the things that I'm like really harping on lately is actually that all of your emotions are physiological to begin with, right? Which is part of what's interesting about doing somatic work, is like a lot of the questions, I mean, you might like know what I'm talking about here. A lot of the questions that I wind up asking people are kind of like, okay, if you're saying that you're experiencing fear, or you're naming this emotion as nervousness, like what is it that's signaling that to you? Like break that down a little bit more. How are you able to identify? How are you able to name that? And then people have to go to like, what's happening in my body that I'm interpreting as fear, right? Or what's happening in my body that I'm interpreting as joy.
Yeah.
It's all signaling that comes from the body.
And I think that I know I have a tendency to, I'm getting much better actually at sort of the work with you, the work with a therapist, like naming my emotions and really feeling into the nuances of like what they are. And it had me realize before that I was kind of being a little bit lazy in, you know, like, oh, is this, and we'll just use non-monogamy for an example. Now I realize that I was hardly ever jealous. Jealousy it's not a thing for me. It was more, you know, this fear that I was inadequate, which is such a different, you know, thing. And like, I was just talking about this on a previous episode, like feeling that like low self-esteem, which is a totally different thing than jealousy, but many people might just lump it in with jealousy. And I love the work that we do so much, and I'm going to share a little bit that's kind of personal about a recent session. And we've done this a lot where, you know, you'll sort of guide me to get present. Maybe I close my eyes and like you give me the space to really talk about like what I'm physically feeling, and the more I go into it, the more I can feel it, and the more I'm understanding like which way the energy is flowing, and like what's the texture of it or the quality of energy. And I mean, it's funny because I'm thinking now, like, not only has it just helped me get more in touch with my body, it's also helped me in the moments when I'm not working with you to be like, okay, you know what, I should check in with my body. And I had this major breakthrough just the other day where one minute I was being present, and then I started to feel this joy of like, wow, this is so fun. Why do I ignore what's happening in my body? And the moment that I realized that I was doing that, I went from like sheer joy to like this beautiful cathartic cry, because I felt so sad that I had been like neglecting my body in that way. And it took me like the evening and journaling to sort of hone in on that. But like, I'll never forget that for this next little process. And it's going to carry me through and like all this other work that I'm doing. And it took like 30 minutes, which is wild.
I'm like internally, I'm just like so excited over here. Like I'm first of all so happy for you.
Mm-hmm.
And you're also like touching on so much like rich stuff about this. Like I love that you use the example of jealousy, because there's actually like, I'm working with a chapter subheading right now that's like, not everything is jealousy. Yeah. And actually getting people to kind of break down like, what is it that you mean when we're talking about jealousy and non-monogamy, because it gets mislabeled like a lot.
Yes.
But then also that sort of breakthrough sensation that you're talking about is like, when I'm talking to people about pleasure and how reclaiming pleasure works, how centering pleasure works, I often talk about it as like pleasure and grief or pleasure and rage are two sides of the same coin. Because usually as we start to like strengthen that pathway and recognize like what joy and pleasure is available to us, we also have to recognize like how much we've been taught to ignore it or box it up or disregard it, and like that comes with a lot of sadness.
So much. It was like it popped the cork for me on, holy shit, there's so much here. And it's so rich, like you said, and there's so much happening that I could never be bored in this experience. And that was, I think, what was really mind-blowing for me, because I tend to think that the outside world and all of the things that I'm up to and all of the things that I love to do are really like the amazing things in life. It's like, oh, the sweet stuff of life. And it is, and it's all beautiful. But there's also so much
there's a lot in there
to be like done and had and felt and seen. And I don't spend a lot of time alone. And I think because I'm like, oh, it's like bored. Like, I think that's my subconscious story, is that like I'm going to be bored with myself. And so I'm having this awakening of like, holy shit, I could just like put me alone in the woods right now. It's kind of where I want to be. I just
send Jess out to nature.
Seriously, I think I like really I'm craving some of that, like, you know, old crone time. Because for me, and this is probably the case for so many people, it's like we live in this constant state where we're not paying attention to our bodies, so we're not hearing the signals and getting to know ourselves. And we could make life so much easier we could heed these signals and signs of like distress so much earlier on before it's, you know, too late in some cases. And I realize as we're speaking, so I want to like back up for a second. So Irene, when I first started working with Irene, it was for the purpose to focus on my pleasure and sort of centralize that in my life because, as I mentioned, you know, being a high achiever, X, Y, and Z, I was leaving very little room for that. And I have 2 partners, and I was like, I'm working all the time. I'm like not focusing on my pleasure in any way, shape, or form. And so like that was the basis. And then, you know, wanting to be a mom, I want to like live a pleasure-filled life and teach that to my kids, all of these cool things. And around the time we started working together, it was when you were just coming out about writing your book, or maybe a little bit later, but you were doing some really cool things and having some like group online sessions. So I wanted to speak to that because people are probably like, what's this book? So
what's this whole writing thing?
Yeah, you gave me some really cool news when we first sat down because I'm like, isn't it called Poly Party Girl? And you're like, actually not anymore. And we're separating it out. And so I think it would be really cool for people to know what you're writing and why, and like how, and like why. Yeah, why. Your why, your how. Because I mean, I know a little bit about your life, but I think it would be cool for everyone listening to hear and maybe to feel seen if this is them too.
Yeah. So, I mean, really, I'll try to be like brief about the first part of this. Like my story with non-monogamy was like, I started stepping into it in a relationship where neither of us really had experience with non-monogamy, but decided that if we were going to continue deepening the intimacy that we had, that was the only way we wanted to do it. And it didn't take very long for me to realize like, oh, this is actually who I am. Like this is a core part of my identity. You know, there's a book that I'm sure you're familiar with and probably a lot of people listening, Polysecure. And if you haven't read it,
yes,
highly recommend it. But something that Jessica Fern talks about is like there's sort of people who are non-monogamous more sort of like contextually and situationally, and then there are people who are non-monogamous really kind of as an identity. And for me, it was like very early on that I was like, oh, this is my identity. Like I don't really know what I'm doing yet,
right?
But I can't go back. And then as I became more attached to this partner, and the dynamics of our relationship were incredibly complicated, and we made a shit ton of mistakes in the beginning. I was working with a coach like a year ago who I sort of told her the beginning of our relationship, and she was like, oh, honey, you did everything that I tell people not to do.
Yeah.
She was like, it's incredible that you're still together. But so anyways, all of that really, like I said, I have a diagnosis of complex PTSD, and it really kicked into gear around this. It was like stepping into non-monogamy and actually putting it into practice was like borderline re-traumatizing me at the same time that I was recognizing this is who I am. And so it was this really scary thing of like, how do I come to terms with who I am if the experience of it is like this intense pain and being triggered all the time? And it's not even that like my partner is doing anything wrong or that there's something harmful happening here, which I think was hard for my monogamous friends to wrap their head around. Right. You know what I mean? Because we have this kind of like women supporting women feeling of like, if you're unhappy in your relationship, the guy's an asshole. Right. And I was like, the guy's not an asshole. Like, I'm just triggered. Yeah. And so it took a lot of working through that. And as those words come out of my mouth, I'm like, I'm not done working through it. Like I very recently, like in the past couple of weeks, have been going through like a whole other wave of it. So it's not something that like I think necessarily even reaches an endpoint. But as I have been resourcing around it and figuring out how to navigate it and figuring out what works and what doesn't, it's been really, really illuminating for me. And also so helpful for my clients who I'm talking to about this. And one of the conversations that I've been having a lot over the past like year and a half was around like non-monogamy is on the up and up, right? Like the last statistics I read were from like 2017, and it was something like 21 or 23% of American adults are currently in some kind of non-monogamous situation. Don't quote me on that, but
we'll fact check it.
But some kind of ballpark like that.
Yeah.
And, you know, that was, 5 years ago now?
Mm-hmm.
But I have a hard time finding narrative representation of people who are poly or non-monogamous where it's not kind of like scandalous or just about sex. And like, it's fine if your non-monogamy is just about sex. But the way that I see it in media is like so not the representative of the people that I know or myself. And I came to a point of being like, okay, I'm kind of over this. Like I need the book out there that makes me feel seen in this. So let me write out my story. I started a memoir manuscript a year ago now that is Poly Party Girl that I like got really deep into. But once I was really deep in it, realized I'm trying to impart so much of what I know helps my clients here in telling this story that I'm actually putting two books together, and I need to first separate them out. And so a few months ago, the writing process for me turned into like, let me focus on this other book that's actually more in the realm of self-help and giving people tools for like, how do you approach non-monogamy in a way that is trauma-informed? How do you work through all of that stuff coming up? And, you know, all the things that are important in non-monogamy of like communication and collaboration and how do you fight better, because conflict can actually be really generative and like all of that kind of stuff. So that book comes out in October, and then I'll get back to Poly Party Girl.
Whoa, that's so soon.
I know.
Like it comes out in October.
Yeah, the release date right now is October 27th.
Oh shit. Oh my gosh, I'm so excited. Wow.
Yeah, me too. There's a lot to do before then, but I'm really stoked about it.
Yeah, okay, we're gonna throw a big party.
Please, I'm like gonna be so ready to celebrate.
Yes. Wow. Well, I'm like, I love hearing that you dove into it and just like wrote everything that was on your heart and then realized that you had two incredible works instead of one. I know for me, it's much needed. I feel like I haven't found the how-to yet. There's a lot of really great books and like, you know, we talk about a lot of the cool books on this show that people can use as a resource. I imagine that yours will be right up there with all of them because people are always saying like, how do I just get into it? That's like the number one question. And there's a lot of great content creators out there. And I think like, as I say that, there's like, it's not even 1% of what's needed because as you're saying, non-monogamy is not going away. And the people that have been practicing for years are starting to feel safe to like even come out of the closet about it. So we're going to see the numbers spike with just the people who've already been doing it. And, you know, you're a community builder. You've already been sort of modeling and teaching this healthy way to go about it. So it's only natural that this book is also going to be informed by all the experience that you already have in helping people do it. So it's not just like, you're like, oh, I'm going to go do this. It's like, you're already living this. And so now we get to memorialize it and have it like, have the work in writing. So I'm curious, maybe for people who are listening, what's sort of the overview and maybe like, what is a taster of how people can use some of the tools that you share, and I know that you've shared with me, to either downregulate their nervous system when they are feeling like those intense activations, when a partner goes out for the first time. I mean, I can't tell you how many first timers I have in my DMs or, you know, who've become friends, like writing to me all the time. And I'm a coach, but I'm certainly not trauma informed. And I think it's so important to have your perspective on this, which is why like October it seems really soon, but can't come fast enough because I can just be like, read this book. Now I don't have to be like,
there you go.
Yeah. So yeah, what are like some really great tools that people can take away today when they are kind of stepping into it to set themselves up for success, and also to know how to soothe the nervous system as this is all happening? Yeah. And I'm sure it's different for everybody, but
it is. And I mean, I think that's an important thing to recognize, like just right out the gate, is like it is different for everyone. Everyone has different things that will set them off unexpectedly. And I think that's really the thing that I see the most in non-monogamy versus like getting triggered in monogamous relationships, is like when people are making that transition, what they're triggered by tends to surprise them more. And one of the kind of pillars for me is getting people to understand that they actually are allowed and would benefit from going a lot slower than they think they need to. Because I see a lot of people sort of like rushing to figure it out. Like there's so much thrill in it, and it's a whole exciting new world, and like I get it.
Everybody wants to go to their first play party.
Everybody wants to go to their first play party. Everyone wants to be sleeping with more than one person and like go home and tell their partner about it.
Yeah.
And also, I mean, that brings me right into like another thing that I talk to people about a lot, is that you're allowed, and it benefits you, to actually really figure out how you want to be communicating. Not just how to communicate, but like how much do you want to know about what a partner is experiencing? When do you want to have those conversations? Do you leave it up to someone to ask, or are there certain markers that you in your partnership are agreeing to communicate about? Because one of the things that I find, like with clients who come to me and they're kind of early on in it and feeling really activated, usually once we get to know each other a little bit, I'll find out that the way communication works in their most attached relationship is just kind of a free-for-all of like, people will be texting coming out of a date or during a date or heading into sleeping with someone else. And it's almost as if they're treating that kind of information as, okay, now that we're open, this operates the same way that like talking about friends would.
Interesting.
You know,
so there's
and
no
it's
like
like
container around this sort of sharing.
Yeah. And I think people, in part of trying to be like good at polyamory or non-monogamy or whatever version you're doing, the person getting activated is trying to just like get there.
Right.
You know, they're trying to be like, okay, well, this is what I'm in for now. So like,
yeah,
I guess tell me.
So I'm gonna read this while I'm making dinner.
Yeah. But what it winds up doing is keeping your nervous system like jacked up, like kind of on alert all the time for like, what information am I going to be fielding at any given moment? So one of the things I talk to people a lot about is containment, and having, you know, it's not exactly like a tool of like, oh, go take 10 deep breaths, which is also helpful. But taking your time, going slow enough that you actually can create the agreements and the structures that suit you, not just the ones that you think sound right.
Yeah.
Right. Getting to have enough trial and error to go like, okay, this feels appealing, or like, oh, this is feeling activating. And so like, let's take a step back and reset.
Yeah. Interesting.
I think the other tool-ish type of thing that I want to offer people is like, particularly around if your partner's going out and you're feeling lonely or grappling with a feeling of like rejection or abandonment. I mean, those are sort of like the two core wounds that we're working with in non-monogamy, right? It's like all your other relationship stuff will come up, but those two show up more in non-monogamy just because of the dynamics. And there's also this thing I see that sort of feels like a hangover from monogamy culture of like, okay, well, I'm going to like white knuckle this and just face my shit.
Yeah.
And it's like, this can be a lot more comfortable than that.
Yeah.
like it's not like you're necessarily going to be comfortable right off, like in the beginning, but I see people sometimes have this tendency to be like, oh, I shouldn't distract myself. I should face whatever these hard emotions are, even if they're totally overwhelming me. And you're allowed to like have a sleepover with a friend to make that feel better.
Right.
You're allowed to like eat a bunch of junk food and watch movies that your partner doesn't like to watch. Like that's one of the things that I talk to people a lot about is like actually like making that alone time really like self-nurturing time.
Right.
And that might mean doing like stretching or going for a walk or embodiment stuff to regulate your system. But it might also just mean like chilling.
Yeah. And like binge watching crap TV or something, like whatever is going to soothe you.
Yeah, is fine. And like needing to rely on other people for that is also okay. Like I think this was true for me, and I also see it with clients somewhat, like particularly in the transition. I think once you get a little bit more into practicing non-monogamy, this doesn't seem to come up as much. But in that transition, feeling like if you're really activated, there's a sense of shame in reaching out to people saying like, hey, I need support around this, or like, can you just be with me?
Right.
Because like people don't, you know, whatever the judgments are.
Yeah, I was thinking that actually as you started to talk about it, it's so helpful to have like a support system, right? For anything that you're going through, you know, especially in your relationship, monogamous, non-monogamous, like whatever it is, like you need a, you know, a good girlfriend, for example, to like the shoulder to cry on maybe. Like it makes me think of how you said like that guy was not an asshole, but it's okay to need somebody. And I think that what a lot of people find, maybe if they're closeted about opening up, is they feel like they can't tell anybody because then it's going to be like, well, it's about the non-monogamy or it's about the polyamory. It's too hard. This is X, Y, and Z. So I think it's a little tough right now as we're still in this world where it's like a bit more other or taboo. But as more people share and feel, you know, the safety or security to like come out about it, that's my hope, is like your friends will accept you like mine had. And I was so nervous to tell people. And then you can like have that other person, which is a very, I feel like polyamorous principles, like leaning on community and like bringing people into your life in an intimate way, even if they're platonic or like non-sexual relationships. But
totally,
they're the best.
Totally.
They're like the best relationships. I feel like that's been one of the most like beautiful things to come out of my polyamory, is like the deep connected intimacy that I have now with so many of my friends that are monogamous and will never be open. Well, maybe. I mean, there's hope for everybody, but
we'll get them in a few more years. Give them time.
I think like, you know, I know that this has been massively healing for me. And I think that's one of the most important things that you share, is like why this type or this style of relationship is such a cause for healing. Can you speak to that?
Yeah. I mean, particularly for like what happens in our bodies and our physiology with trauma, what we have to work through in order to transition from monogamy to non-monogamy actually gives us a lot of the healing that those mechanisms want. Like, for example, when you're really triggered, when you have some kind of trauma that's activated, the thinking tends to become very black and white, right? I'm just thinking, like, I have some friends that I feel like in like social media land, this like sort of broadly gets labeled like trauma brain. And one way to recognize whether or not you're triggered is noticing like, oh, is everything like all or nothing in how I'm presenting it?
That's a really good.
Right? Like if I notice that everything is like either I'm like disappearing to India for a year to
Yeah.
like reset my entire life, or I'm like getting married to 3 partners at once,
Yeah.
then like maybe I'm activated.
Right. That was me the other night over like a light switch in our bedroom. I was like, that's it.
We're getting divorced. So, but that's the body, right? And so if part of the practice here is recognizing, okay, that way of thinking means something's activated for me. What soothing needs to happen here? There are all kinds of things like that in how trauma operates that when we're in non-monogamy, we have to like bring a little more finesse to it, right? Like black and white thinking doesn't work really in any relationships, but it really doesn't work if you're trying to navigate like more than one person at once.
Right.
Right. And it also, particularly for complex PTSD and lots of other emotional stuff, I just kind of like harp on CPTSD because it includes so much emotional dysregulation that it kind of like somehow touches on like all these other things. But one of the things about that is one of the core experiences in it is what we call toxic shame, which becomes this sort of like looping cycle of like not feeling okay to ask for what you need. And so just figuring out how to accommodate all the people around you so that you don't have to face the rejection, you don't have to face the abandonment, those core wounds in non-monogamy, and figuring out your way through that, actually learning to say to partners, here's what I'm experiencing. Can you help me understand if it's true? Right? Like, here's this fear that's coming up. Can you like fact check me?
Yeah.
I actually just did this on the way over here. I've been working through a major trigger recently and was on the phone with my partner and was like, I'm having this narrative that's like really scary for me and is coming up in a really intense way. And I'm afraid to even ask you whether or not it's true. Like, that's how intense this is. And getting into that practice of saying like, I'm terrified, but then someone's going to meet me in it. Changes that narrative over time, right?
Yeah.
It helps me like recondition, like, okay, I don't have to believe all these thoughts. This wiring doesn't stay fixed forever. It gets to be like a corrective experience.
Wow. Thank you for sharing.
Yeah.
As you're sharing, I'm just thinking like how beautiful it is to know that someone who's been practicing this, you know, for years and educating on it is still like deep in the work. And that gives this amazing feeling of like, I think hope, not only to me, but like everybody listening who is like, okay, it's not I can do it or I can't do it. It's like everyone can do it. And the work is so worthy because you're experiencing this stuff anyway on a low level, even in your monogamous relationship, potentially for most people.
Well, it's like all the skills you need for non-monogamy, you also need in monogamy. Non-monogamy just like throws that need in front of your face a little bit more harshly.
Right. Do you think that people who are likely non-monogamous, every time I say that, I'm like, am I saying this right? Who are likely non-monogamous or polyamorous, really in maybe nature and not yet practice and maybe haven't like opened up to it. Do you think that they would, this is like such a hypothetical, I don't know, end up in these monogamous relationships and be deeply unsatisfied if they stay in those relationships for long term? Or do you think that they would find ways to facilitate different types of growth and evolution within their monogamous container that could help them evolve at the same way or at the same pace and at the same, I don't know, like full expression as being in an open relationship of some sort?
It is such a hypothetical and I want to take it in so many directions. But I think, so one of the things that comes up for me is like in more the realm of like sex coaching and intimacy work, we play a lot with fantasy, right? If we're having mismatched needs or mismatched desires, one realm that can be really, really, really useful for people is tapping into fantasy and actually like doing a lot of development around fantasy.
Yeah.
And I think that's one avenue where like if someone at their core identity is polyamorous or non-monogamous, but they're in a monogamous relationship, like that's one way that they might sort of like, even just intuitively, right? Without like seeking out extra support or a different relationship structure or whatever, like that might just come up for them, right? Because our systems are intuitive and find these ways of like getting our needs met. But I also think there's like two other things that come to mind really strongly for me. One is like, I think we are starting to find more, like the more non-monogamy is spoken about publicly, the more people are feeling empowered to kind of like test that out a little bit, even just in conversation with their partners, like kind of float the feeler of like, hey, how do you feel? Like, I saw this thing, like, what do you think about it?
Right.
You know? And then the other thing that brings up for me is not actually like really about tapping into non-monogamous identity, but kind of like this like flip side of that for me is like, I didn't realize I was queer until I was poly. Like I wasn't into other genders until I started having other experiences. And one of the things that I've been writing about a lot that I don't think will necessarily make it into the book, but I have a whole other thing about it, is like the sort of compulsory performance of heterosexuality if your sexuality is fluid. Right? Just like what we were talking about in the beginning of kind of like tapping into your own body and your own sensations. There's so much that conditions that out of us from a really early age, that for those of us who have a more fluid sexuality, what winds up happening for a lot of us is we compartmentalize the part that's not like socially acceptable or fully mainstream, not consciously, but just to kind of like get by in the life that we think we're expected to have. And so, I mean, that was like very, very, very true for me, and was really, was also part of like the scary, startling part about getting into non-monogamy and realizing like, oh, holy shit, like has my whole sexuality been conditioned for other people? Like to what extent is my sexuality my own versus like society's?
Wow. That right there just kind of stopped me, because I'm like, I resonate with that so much, and I never really thought about it in that way, in that light of, okay, interesting. Because for me too, I didn't even realize that I was queer until I was like open and poly and, you know, Lauren, and I was like mind blown that that was even there, and how much of that could have been possible in my previous life. You know, previous life meaning like before 32 years old or whatever, 34 years old. Wow, that's going to give me something to think about and journal about. I appreciate it. Homework for everyone.
And I also just like to the original question there want to like validate that there are so many reasons, and like very good valid reasons for people to maybe like know this inside themselves and not act upon it. Like as much as the landscape is changing, it still has so many complicated layers around it for people.
Right. Theme being, go slow.
Exactly.
Theme being,
exactly.
You don't have to rip off all the bandages
Theme
at
being,
once.
no urgency.
Zero when it comes to this stuff. Yeah, just tread lightly. And like I always say, you know, if this is, especially because I think a lot of people who, or at least just the people who want to talk to me, a lot of times they are coupled and they're in relationships, a lot of times long-term relationships that they want to open. And it's like, if this is your person, you've already like known this for years, and you know this is your life partner, just speaking to this
What's the
experience.
rush?
Like, what is the rush? You've got another 60 years. And apparently it only gets like hotter and hotter when you're like when you're retired.
I mean, this is the other thing I say to people. I have clients who are in their 40s and 50s who are like, I've missed the boat. And I'm like, who taught you that?
Yeah.
Like, what? I'm like, no, if we actually, the earlier you start working on your sexual communication, the hotter your sex is going to be in your 70s and 80s.
Right. Let's pray. Like, I do not want to stop having sex really ever until it's like likely that I might break a hip. Like, I want to be old and
even then it might be worth the risk.
Right. This is going to be such a valuable episode for people who are really just starting to either dip their toes in or who have been practicing but are like, wow, these are so many more actionable sort of steps we can take to increase our communication and contain it. I really loved that part that you shared. Even for me, thinking back to how Pasha and I used to do it, we were so willy-nilly texting and the times that we actually, I just thought of this, made it a practice to wait until we were physically together to share things with each other, not only were just way more special, but way more generative in our like sex and sexuality and our intimacy. I mean, because, you know, for people who listen to this show, you know that was like also a big turn on for me. And so it took it from being this like casual share into this place of like, oh, this might incite some play. But if it doesn't for you, then it's also a place to be like physically held and taken care of. And it's like, it's almost like you get your version of aftercare too. If you can wait to be like in person, which I think is really, I don't know, special. For us, we've always wanted to, you know, in just our dynamic being like having a primary partnership, make sure that our outside partners, whether they be somebody that we see together or just like two separate relationships, we're always bringing energy into our relationship, and that we're also bringing energy to those people's lives, even if like I'm not being intimate with them. And so I just, that piece about the container for me was like one of the most cool things that I've heard about this work that's different and that no one's ever really shared. So I appreciate that.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
I mean, that's been a game changer for me. And like it changes, it's fluid. And also like knowing that you can create a container with intention and that you get to receive the benefit more. Right? I almost think of it as like what you were saying with the body of like tuning into what's there makes it easier to access like how much of it there is and like amplifies the sensation just by like orienting to it.
Yeah.
If I create a container where I know like, okay, when I orient to this realm of intimacy with my partner, I can really receive what the benefits are and what that intimacy is. It's like I take it in that much deeper.
Right. You're creating that present space. And like with anything in life, when you meet it with presence, you're just going to get so much more out of it. Do you have anything else that you want to share or that's on your heart before we wrap up?
I mean, I'm really excited about the book. I might have a title for you by the time this actually goes out.
I hope so. Actually, you probably will, because this will come out next month, actually.
Yeah.
Yay.
So the title will be in the notes.
The title will be insert title.
Maybe but other than that, it's just been such a pleasure to be here. I'm so happy.
Me too. I'm so glad we did this. I appreciate you, your work so much, your sisterhood, and just everything about you.
Thank you.
Yeah. Well, my loves, this has been another epic episode of Open Late. I'm so grateful for all of you that listen, that review the show, that are following us on Instagram and TikTok, where I share sometimes educational content about this work. And of course, don't forget, we have some free resources. If you are interested and not really sure what relationship style is right for you, we made a quiz. It's very quick to take. It takes 10 minutes and can really open your eyes to the different types of open relationship that might suit you best. And of course, have a beautiful week. And as I've learned from Irene, focus and centralize on your pleasure. And everyone else in your life is a lot happier when you do.
It's true. It ripples out.
Bye, my loves.